I'm so honored to be able to join you. When I was thinking about what it would be good to talk about today, I thought it might be helpful to talk about what gets in the way of us actualizing this goal of unity and diversity. And I thought the best way to talk about that would be to share a little bit about my story and how I learned to think about these issues a little bit differently, and how that change in perspective equipped me to feel comfortable and responsive in working in the area of diversity. So to start with my story, we'll start with the beginning. When I was a little kid, I went to Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School, and all of my heroes were these international figures, right? I idolized Mother Teresa and Gandhi and Mandela. I was a kid, right? So where do you go if you want to be a peacemaker? You go to war. And for me, that meant attending university in Washington, D.C., and studying conflict resolution and international service. And when I graduated, I landed my dream job. And I worked for an organization called Seeds of Peace. And what Seeds of Peace does is it brings youth from opposite sides of a conflict together to a summer camp in Maine. So Americans and Afghans, Indians and Pakistanis, new immigrants and traditional white communities, youth from these prospective places come together, and they get to have a traditional American summer camp experience. Go on the ropes course, swim in the lake. But in addition, they meet for 2 hours every day in facilitated dialogue to talk about the roots of their conflict. So the theory of change with this organization is that if you bring young people together and they learn to humanize the other side, their enemy, that when they go back to their home countries and they access positions of power, they'll use that power to change and end the conflicts between them. So the organization started doing this work around 1993, and I started in 2007. So by the time I joined, they had had about 15 years of experience doing this type of program. And I do want to say that the personal transformation that took place in that summer camp was real. I saw young people who were afraid to go to sleep at night because they were sleeping in the same cabin as an Israeli or a Palestinian or an American, completely distraught on departure day, because the relationships that they had formed were so powerful and deep. We actually kept a running list of how many cross-conflict marriages were a result of this program. So the personal transformation was real, but what happened to that transformation of the conflicts from which they came? Does anyone know much about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the last 20 to 30 years? Not many people would say it got better, right? So what happened? How can we have this strong personal transformation and not that societal transformation? And the experience that I think answers this question most for me is with an Israeli participant named Gil. So Gil came to the program in the early 90s. He was one of the first who joined. And part of my job was to actually do our alumni relations, so to keep track of participants and see where are they now. And Gil was one of the participants that we were really watching, because slowly but surely he was making his way up through the political establishment in Israel. And by 2008, he had become the chief of staff to the Israeli Foreign Minister Tizni Livni. So all of our staff and all of the organization and all of the other youth who went to summer camp with Gil were ready to see what he was going to do with this position of power. And it was with that hope that we all watched as Gil stood behind Tizni Livni as she announced the war on Gaza in 2008. And so a little bit about the Gaza Strip. It's a Palestinian territory where almost 2 million people live. 70% of the people who live there are refugees from the Israeli War of Independence. And the territory is so small that you can't actually run a marathon in it. You'd have to turn back. There's not enough space. And Gil stood there as they were announcing an aerial bombardment and invasion. So how could this be? How could he stand there knowing what he knew about Palestinians and their humanity, having gone to summer camp with them as they were condemned to die? Eventually, 1,000 unarmed Palestinian civilians were killed. So what happened here? I learned a couple things through this experience. The first thing I learned is that proximity does not equal equity or equality. As I was thinking through this problem, I came across the fact that Africans fought with the colonists in the American Revolution. That didn't change our country from expanding and institutionalizing slavery. Men and women can be in deep and loving relationships with each other, but that man can still go to work and pay a female employee less than he would pay a male employee to do the same job. So it'd be wonderful to think that we could solve issues of diversity and exclusion by just getting together and understanding and knowing each other a little bit better. But unfortunately, that's not the whole picture. We have to do more. We have to be more intentional in our work. The other thing that I learned is what a disservice we were doing to those young people by bringing them when they're 16, telling them they're leaders, and telling them they were responsible for changing the societies in which they came, while we did nothing about the ways in which their societies would change them upon their return. Because what actually happened in the end is the influence of their societies was more powerful than the knowledge they gained of their enemies' humanity. So again, what does that have to do with us and this conversation here? Well, for me, once I saw this power of socialization happen to Gil and the thousands of other participants in our program, I had to ask the question, what is the influence of our society on me? And the answer to that question is why I can stand here and say that I know I can exhibit racism. I also know that I've internalized limitations on myself because of what our society says about gender. And I'm not saying that because I'm proud of these things, but because I'm no longer naive to think that I'm immune to all of the messages and all of the experiences that we're surrounded by. I say it so that I can face it. Here's the thing, if we can't face our socialization, if we don't believe it exists or we can't see it or name it. If we can't see our socialization, then we only have ourselves to blame when we're faced with inequality or injustice around us. And if we only have ourselves to blame, then more often than not, we'll react with shame. And shame's a really powerful emotion for us as humans, and it can exhibit itself in a lot of different ways. Sometimes shame can look like silence. We shut down about an issue. We don't engage. We can't talk about it. Sometimes shame can look like a justification for the way things are, or defensiveness. So we have to start becoming more aware of these reactions as we have them. And again, I'm not trying to overwhelm you, but I'm bringing this up because maybe you're having some of these reactions tonight. Maybe something that you've heard or will hear tonight makes you a little bit uncomfortable, or maybe even offended. So I wanted to share with you what I've learned to do when those feelings arise in me. So the first thing I do is I have to ask myself, am I responding to something that I personally said or didn't say, or did or didn't do that's within my frame of influence, right? So part of being able to answer this question is we have to understand what we have control and capacity to influence. And that's going to be different for each one of us. A politician has a lot more influence and control than a student. So part of answering that question is figuring out where can I have an impact. And if your answer to this question is yes, this is within my sphere of influence, then that is amazing, because that means that you can do something about it. You can repair the harm, you can apologize, you can learn, you can grow, you can be held accountable. Those are all amazing things we can do if the answer to that question is yes. And if the answer to the question is this within my sphere of influence is no, then we have to learn to let it go. We can't allow ourselves to get stuck in shame. We can't allow ourselves in taking responsibility for the whole of a system to be immobilized from changing the part that we can mend. And if your answer to that question is yes, this is within my sphere of influence, but I have no idea what to do about it, then I hope that you'll reach out to me and that we'll do this work together. Thank you.